So I mean, typically the concept behind loot boxes has already been like, I guess you can say it's kind of already been discussed, but I still think loot boxes are very interesting. Similar to the battle pass system that games have, it's still interesting because you could have something like you could have a good loot box system, and then you could just have something just totally utter trash, you know? But yeah.
Welcome to Loot Boxes, Legal Pitfalls and Loopholes. My name is Will Bucher. I'm an IP litigator for a law firm, Debevoise in Plimpton in New York City. That's a fancy way of saying I help media companies, mostly video game companies, when they get sued. And then I also spend my days helping those companies avoid situations that might get them sued. Today, we're going to be talking about regulation of loot boxes, and we're going to focus on 3 regions: the United States, the European Union, and China. And I'm going to be talking to you about where there are regulations, and in the countries and regions where there are regulations, what you need to know about them and what you need to do to modify your game so that you can release in that jurisdiction. This is a business and marketing talk, and so for the first 27 minutes of this half-an-hour presentation, that's going to be focused on the rules and how you can avoid them. For the last 3 minutes, I will talk a little bit about, as a community, how we ethically want to use loot boxes, but the focus of today's presentation is on the rules, because I want to give you the tools and let you decide how you want to use them. Before we can start talking about loot boxes, we have to get on the same page about what a loot box is. And I think that question is a little harder than it appears at first. Most of us have an idea of what a loot box is in our mind. We might think of the stereotypical, you pay money or some green gems for a box that has some randomized items. But the truth is, there's a lot of chance involved in everything we do in life. And I could argue that anything on this screen is a loot box. I'm not going to go through each of these items, but I want to point out a couple of the items that are on this screen. In the middle there, you see just sort of a procedurally generated monster. We've had these in games for decades. And the mechanics are actually very similar to a loot box, right? The player gets a random assortment of items. Most of the time, those items are bad. Sometimes they're really good. And so there's some similarities there, right? Loot boxes really aren't that different from something we've been doing for a long time. What about that last example, right? I call a car a loot box, right? Let's say I invest in Bitcoin and I hodl that Bitcoin until I can afford my Lambo, and I go to the dealership and the dealer says to me, do you want the extended warranty? And I say, no, I want to save that money to invest in more Bitcoin. And 366 days later, my drivetrain blows out. I'm out $500,000. But no one is trying to say that I have to take the extended warranty. No one's trying to regulate that practice, but we face chance in everything we do. And because it's so hard to define what a loot box is, the answer to what a loot box is in today's presentation is it depends on the regulator. We see regulators governing loot boxes in different ways, and that's because I don't really think loot boxes are a problem in the game development industry, but I do think some loot boxes are symbolic of some very real issues we face. I think some loot boxes create compulsion loops. These are Skinner box mechanics that keep players playing much longer than they actually want to play. Some loot boxes are symbolic of pay-to-win mechanics, where players feel like they're not being rewarded for their time or their skill, but just the money they put in. Some loot boxes are used in outright fraud, and a lot of loot boxes aren't transparent. It's not clear to the user what they're going to get and what their odds are. And so when we see loot boxes regulated, we actually see them targeting these 4 other practices. So with that, let's start with the United States. Now, the United States gets a reputation as a country where corporations make all the rules and there's no consumer protection. And in the case of loot boxes, that's absolutely right. There is no government organization, no agency, none of the 50 states that place any formal rules on the use of loot boxes. But there actually are some rules on the use of loot boxes in the United States, and those come from private companies. Those companies are the Esrb, that's the ratings organization here in the United States, and Apple through the App Store. If you have a mobile game that you're selling on iOS devices, Apple has rules you're going to have to comply with. I'll put a little asterisk here. That doesn't mean you can just commit outright fraud. If you're lying to your consumers, that's illegal, and that's been illegal for over a century, centuries, very long time. So don't use this as an excuse to do otherwise illegal things, but there's no specific loot box regulation. So let's talk about those private company rules. So for Apple, you must disclose the odds by item type, right? And Apple defines loot boxes as mechanisms that provide randomized virtual items for purchase. So Apple's there's 3 requirements to be in the loot box bucket. Has to be virtual item, has to be randomized, and has to be for purchase. I think that sort of lines up with most of our notions of loot boxes, right? And when I say disclosed by item type, what I mean by that is think of sort of the classic game that has a common item, rare item, an epic item, and a legendary item. That's what I mean by type. You don't have to list every single item and the odds of getting each and every item, but you have to list them by categories when you're selling on the App Store. What about ESRB? How does the ratings organization define loot boxes? Well, they sort of don't. They lump loot boxes in with any in-game purchase, right? And the requirement for ESRB is that you include an in-game purchases label underneath your rating. I put an example up there in the lower right-hand corner. That's what the in-game purchases tab looks like, and that's an effort for transparency. The people who use ratings most are parents, and what parents care most about is how much is their child going to spend in the game. And they want to know if their child is going to spend more money. They don't really care that it's in the format of a loot box or a randomized capacity. So now I'm going to bring us into a hypothetical. I find it's easier to think about these ideas in a context that might be more similar to the one you would face in your own company as a developer or publisher. It's not going to be particularly complicated, but in our hypothetical today, we have a game developer, Shady Corp, and they're releasing a game, Drawn Out Chess. And this is a classic game of chess, but it's monetized by selling skins, specifically selling skins through loot boxes. They release the games with no disclosures, no consideration of the regulations, and a month later, an employee spots the issue. Right? This actually happens a lot. People realize after the fact they're doing something wrong, and the question is, what does the developer do here as a company? Well, let's start with ESRB. What does Drawn Out Chess have to do to comply with the ratings? Well, if they're ESRB rated, they have to include that sticker. But in my hypothetical, this game is actually only being released on Steam and iOS. And what that means is they don't need an ESRB rating at all. Most games published today are not rated by the ESRB because neither Steam nor the App Store require that the games be rated. Okay, so what about for Apple? Well, for Apple, there needs to be a disclosure by item type, like I talked about. So that means Shady Corp needs to divide their items into categories and list those percentage odds for the players. They can't actually formally backtrack. Apple says that the disclosure has to be before the purchase. So there's actually no way to become compliant here. And somewhat frustratingly, Apple doesn't have formal rules for what you do when you mess up. So my best advice to Shady Corp here would be fix the game, start disclosing in advance, and then do nothing else. And then if Apple comes talking to you, apologize, negotiate with them, work out a solution. But there's actually no formal process for how to remedy a violation. Okay, here are some takeaways. I know it's sometimes helpful to sort of have bullet points. Feel free to take photos of these slides. Takeaways for US regulation are ESRB requires disclosure, but there's no requirement that your game actually have an ESRB rating for most online sale platforms. All iOS games must disclose odds by item type. That disclosure must be prior to purchase. And there's no regulation on loot boxes, but that doesn't mean other laws don't apply. So now let's talk about the EU. So in the EU right now, there's country-specific regulation. That means every country in the EU gets to make up their own decision. Some countries, Germany, France, even PEGI, which is the equivalent of the ESRB in the EU, have called for EU-wide regulation, but right now we haven't seen any of it. So that means right now, other than 2 countries, you can do whatever you want in the EU, just like in the United States. The 2 countries that have rules are Belgium and Holland. In Belgium, it's illegal to have any acquirable item where chance is involved. So Belgium defines loot boxes as the purchase with real money or with paid virtual currency. That's sort of like the green gems, the premium currency in your games, and where chance is involved. So you can sell items directly to players, but what you can't sell is these sort of randomized loot boxes. Holland is actually a little more permissive. Holland makes it illegal where the item is acquirable with real money, where there's chance involved, and where the final prize is transferable. Right? So you actually have some more options in Holland. Oftentimes the 2 countries get lumped together, but I think it's actually much easier to operate in Holland than it is in Belgium. So we'll continue our hypothetical. Shady Corp expands its drawn-out chess offerings to Europe. What do they need to do and where? Okay, well, the answer for most countries is simple. They don't need to do anything. For Belgium, the answer is they probably need to put a geofence on the purchase of their loot boxes. Right? They can publish their game, but they can't have those purchasable loot boxes in the game. For Holland, Shady Corp has another option. They could either geofence the purchase of the loot box, or they could prohibit players who have IP addresses in Holland from transferring their items. So you could still have those loot boxes in your game as long as the player can't transfer. And oftentimes, it's more profitable to restrict the transfer of the items after the fact than to restrict the outright purchase of loot boxes. I think what these different regulations highlight, and this may become more important in the future if we see other jurisdictions implementing regulations, and this is my 3rd bullet point on these takeaways here, is that when you as a developer or publisher are building your game, you want to make sure every feature of your game can be toggled on and off, or at least every monetization feature. Right? Because if you're in a position where you can't turn off the sale of loot boxes, then that means you just can't sell your game at all in these countries. You're limiting yourself from a market that might still be profitable despite the regulations. So as you're building your game, build with these considerations in mind, that there are rules that are different by country and that those rules may change over time. Other big takeaways are in Holland, you have a choice. You can restrict the transfer or the sale of loot boxes. In Belgium, you have to restrict the sale of randomized items for purchase. And then sort of my final point is I've seen these calls for EU-wide regulation. I don't expect it to happen soon, although you ask 100 lawyers and you get 100 different opinions on that. So far, the sort of takeaway has been there's not a lot of regulation, and it's pretty easy to get around it. China's sort of a different story. In China, loot boxes are regulated by 2 different organizations, one with a focus on content, and the other with a focus on monetization and mechanics. We're going to start by going through the formal rules, and then we'll talk about sort of how that ends up working in practice. So formally, on the monetization, you cannot have a randomized event. Right? China defines a loot box as any randomized event. That seems a little overbroad, doesn't it? Right? That seems like everything I put up on that first slide in the presentation today. But you can have a randomized event for purchase with real money or virtual currency. This might be a translation issue. I think virtual currency actually means paid virtual currency. We haven't really seen any enforcement against games where you just have the gold you collect naturally through gameplay. But formally, it says any virtual currency. So as written and as translated into English, that could be even the currency you only can earn through gameplay. Second rule is the virtual items or services that you offer have to be obtainable by other means. What are other means? That could mean that you could get it through gameplay, you could get it through randomized drops from killing monsters in the game. You could have it so that the only way to get the item is to purchase it outright from the store or get a loot box. So you can still have items that are only purchasable for real money, but there has to be some other way to get that item. And then the third requirement is no compulsion loops. These are like sort of Skinner box mechanics. We'll talk about in our hypothetical for this country about what that might look like even in the context where you weren't directly selling the loot boxes. But that's not all. China has regulations on disclosures, and these are super onerous regulations. The first is you need to provide information about the odds for your loot box up front. And that information is not like Apple, where it's by type. You're formally supposed to list your odds of getting every single item in that loot box. Now, that may just mean that you're taking the number of items that are in a category and dividing that category percentage to list them. But it is a more formal requirement. But not only do you have to list your odds in advance, those odds have to be transparent to users. That means it's easy for a Chinese user to find those odds, right? Can't be complicated, can't be, at the very bottom of your page, click here to see the odds. Basically, if they run a search for those odds, they should be able to find them. And then the final requirement, which is incredibly labor intensive, is that every game is supposed to keep for 90 days and publicly make available the results of every single loot box outcome in their game. Thousands or millions of outcomes kept in a chart, and it's supposed to be publicly available. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Will, I bet you $50, you can't find a single company operating in China that does that. And if you're thinking that, you'd be up $50. I searched through the top 20 licensed games in China, and I wasn't able to find it. And so then I called my colleague in Hong Kong, because I said, look, maybe it's a language barrier. And my colleague in Hong Kong couldn't find a single game that did that either. So I think what you see in China is a lot of rules, but really inconsistent enforcement of those rules. And the truth is, whether or not you can offer a loot box in China depends on whether the government likes your game. So now we're going to come into today's last hypothetical. And this has to deal with dynamic odds adjustment. So it's March, and Shady Corp's game is doing well, but they want it to do better. And so they're going to engage in dynamic odds adjustment. What do I mean by that? That means adjusting the odds of the outcomes for your loot box in the hopes of denying the player what they really want, so they keep buying more loot boxes. This can target a specific player. We might have data and metrics that tell us about an individual player. But that sort of odds adjustment can be done on a wider basis. So in our example, it's March. Right? St. Patrick's Day was Sunday. And Shady Corp realizes their players really want to play with their St. Patrick's Day themed chess set. And so previously, when you got one of their legendary chess sets, there was an even chance of getting a pirate chess set, a ninja chess set, a Halloween chess set. But they're going to adjust the odds so the odds of getting that St. Patrick's Day chess set go down. And not only are they going to do that, they realize no one wants a Halloween chess set in March. So they're going to increase the odds of that chess set. And the hope here is that the players don't get what they want, and so they keep purchasing more loot boxes. So let's talk globally. Is this practice legal? What does Shady Corp have to do to make it legal? Well, in the United States, yeah, currently you can do this. Even Apple's terms, right, only require disclosure of those top-level categories. And here, Shady Corp isn't changing the odds of getting a legendary item. They're just changing the odds a level below that, within the odds. So they don't even need to change their disclosures to comply with Apple's terms. It's conceivable that if they might get an action for fraud brought against them. But if they have a good lawyer, they're probably going to be okay right now in the United States. What about the EU? Similar answer, although I'd say EU courts are sort of more favorable to sort of creative legal actions. So even though there's no strict law prohibiting it, probably slightly riskier in the EU. Obviously, you can't do this in Belgium. I think you could still do it in Holland as long as you didn't restrict transfers. So what about China, the country we just talked about? Well, this violates the formal rules for a lot of reasons. First, it's a purchasable loot box. But even if there was geofencing for China, so that the game didn't have purchasable loot boxes there, this would still violate their rules, because this creates a compulsion loop. Even if the only way to get the loot box was from gameplay, this encourages the players to purchase the loot to get more and more, because they're never getting what they want out of it. So that's sort of where the compulsion loop rule comes in China. But of course, as we've seen in China, particularly with the disclosure requirements, often those rules aren't enforced. So maybe the answer here would be to work with a partner in China who has influence, although that's less successful than it used to be. So our takeaways for Chinese regulation is no loot boxes purchasable with real money or virtual currency. There's flexible and unclear rules that give the government a lot of enforcement power. And there's a particular focus from the regulatory entities on preventing these compulsion loops. There's disclosure requirements that exist in China and in Apple's requirements, but in practice, these requirements can be designed around or simply ignored. And then that final point is, I'd recommend working with a partner who's established in China if you're doing these practices there. So to wrap up my presentation today, how are loot boxes regulated? Well, it depends on the regulator. But there's no major regulation in Western countries outside of Holland and Belgium, and there's inconsistent enforcement in China. And that answer's right, but there's also a second right answer, which is how loot boxes are regulated depends on what everyone in this room does going forward. Just because as of March 2019 there's no loot box regulation doesn't mean there won't be tomorrow. And whether you realize it or not, as a developer or a publisher, you're part of a collective dialogue about how we interact with our players, our customers, and about how we want to be regulated. And so I urge you going forward to be careful how you use loot boxes and to take simple steps to prevent problems. Have parental controls that can be enabled so that young children don't purchase loot boxes. You can reach out to players who you think might be exhibiting problematic behavior and who you also think may not have the money to be doing so. The simplest and most important thing you can do is when your colleagues or your friends or your parents talk to you about loot boxes, don't paint it as a black and white issue. Don't just say loot boxes are okay or they're bad, because the truth is it's not loot boxes that are a problem. Which the problem is when loot boxes are used to do other things, when they're used to create those compulsion loops to keep players playing longer than they want to, when they're used to create pay-to-win mechanics, so players can't win from their skill or time no matter how long they play the game. Loot boxes are a problem when they're not transparent, when players don't know what's going on. And when we frame the discussion as solving these other problems, I think we realize that there's all sorts of game mechanics that can run into these issues. And the key is how we use the mechanics, not whether we use them. To be clear, I'm not worried about a world where this is regulated. I don't want this regulated, but I'm okay with it being regulated. But I'm concerned that the people who are going to pass the regulations aren't gamers. They're not lawyers like me who spend their days working on these issues. And that instead of getting this regulated, what we're going to get is all of this regulated. And by having those thoughtful discussions, by shaping the dialogue in a way that highlights the real issues, while acknowledging that oftentimes loot boxes are fine, we can prevent entering this world where all this is regulated. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to come to today's talk. I put my contact info up on the board. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we don't, I will be in the wrap-up room. There's tables down the hall right outside of 305. I'm happy to stick around and talk about these issues for as long as you guys would like. The other reminder I'll give you is to please fill out your feedback surveys. Last year after I presented, I'll say I was really impressed with the detailed feedback you gave and the positive feedback about what I could do better, what I could do more of. Hopefully I've incorporated that this year, and I'll try and incorporate it next year too. So thank you so much, guys.